Okay, so where we left off on Thursday, we were talking about the Newtonian synthesis. And we were really talking about it as an intellectual system that was able to draw from principles that were occult and hermetical, religious, theological, and also progressive and mechanical. So it was able to take potentially incredibly destructive, discordant ideas that could have just shred modernity apart. We might not have had one. But instead, the Newtonian synthesis takes potentially ideas that are in profound conflict and does more than just a synthesis. It creates a synergy that is going to create an incredibly powerful coalition of politics, science, religion, ethics, culture, rolled into a much larger synthesis, which will be the platform and the program for modernity and the British Enlightenment. So just to recap, and really briefly, because we did go over this already, the crucial elements of that synthesis. Well, he understood that we are indeed living in a universe, that there is not some weird Aristotelian cosmos with special laws for the celestial sphere and then different kinds of laws for the terrestrial sphere. In fact, the very motions you observe on this planet, say I throw an apple, mechanical inertia might throw it against, make it head towards the back wall, and gravity is going to pull it to the ground, and the shape of its pathway is going to be a parabola. That exact parabolic motion that he observed in the terrestrial plane has a celestial equivalent in the planetary orbits he sees in the sky, and the exact same forces are at work. Inertia and gravity. Mechanical force and this mysterious, attractive gravitational force. So you see, he's uniting the terrestrial and the celestial plane. He unites the mechanical. Okay, what's going on with this?
It's rubbing against something.
Okay. No, it's a problem. Okay, that's bad. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right. No. Oh, that's better, isn't it? No wonder I couldn't hear myself before. Okay. Okay, so the mechanical and the attractive principles, the mathematical and the physical. So what I mean by that is computation, quantification, that intellectual, cerebral exercise, right? That Descartes advanced as the premier program, right? Analytical geometry was the way we mapped the entire universe. That's important. And Newton keeps that. But he unites it to appreciation for the physical, the sensory, what he can observe, what he can experiment upon. So it's very, very empirical. And he, as we said before, because of his sense of awe and mystery, because he understood that the primary objective of science was literally to observe and wonder at God's mystery and creativity and ingenuity. The primary goal of the natural philosopher wasn't to know and master the knowledge of the universe as it might have been for Descartes. It wasn't to explain everything in such a thorough way that God just became an object of your analysis, but to literally, he uses the word wonder at the creative ingenuity, right, of God. And he also makes us comfortable with a world that is both occult, mysterious, never really explains what gravity is. When he doesn't know what something is, he says, give it a rest, no fingo hypotheses, I don't make hypotheses. And yet, he gives us 3 laws of motion and a principle of gravity that can be written all on a cocktail napkin, right? Better than the Monas Hieroglyphica in terms of its efficient encryption, right, of the mysteries of the universe, except they're in simple mathematical formulas. Now, you and I might not be able to read the Principia and understand it,
In that way, it is a truly mysterious. How an exercise of tremendous elite genius to understand the proofs by which he created these formulas. But the important thing is, anybody can be a Newtonian. Not everyone can be Newton. Hard to prove this stuff. But once he gives us the formulas, they're exoteric, plain, easy to understand. Anybody can be a Newtonian. And there was an important thing about gravity as well that really makes this synthesis possible. Newton never told us what gravity is, but for Newton, gravity was quite possibly God's loving energy and presence and caring present here with us in the universe. Think about gravity. It's everywhere. It's superimposed on every single piece of matter. Now, matter is lifeless and inert in Newton's cosmos. We don't have that spooky matter that's getting an idea, oh, I'm going to fall to the ground, not because of some impersonal force of gravity, but because I want to join the Earth. It's a force that is still imposed on matter, disciplining matter, determining matter. So we don't get a crazy, spooky universe. But this force is the lawful, loving will of God. And Newton also noticed that when he ran the calculations, those planetary orbits weren't actually all that stable. That if you just go by the numbers, looks like Mars might be crashing into the sun sometime soon. However, he understood that it was God's presence, constantly restoring energy to the planetary system, that made this wonderful harmony work. So Newton, even though he makes gravity so simple to understand, remember there was that simple formula. It's a simple formula that is attached to the deepest, deepest religious mystery. And it's a simple formula that you can plug into equations that are analyzing mechanical motion. So gravity, even though it is this divine presence, is also subject to very practical, rote, mathematical calculations by which you can say launch an industrial revolution, right? This is going to be so simple and so practical, we're going to get an explosion of applied science or technology. And because these principles that Newton espoused reconciled so many different aspects of thought from the 1600s, the Royal Society was extremely receptive. So Newton didn't go it alone. He didn't walk into a vacuum, right? Newton had the support of the Royal Society. They're the ones that translate the Principia so the rest of the world can understand it. They give him the institutional support he needs so that we can all become Newtonians. Without their support, perhaps if we didn't have that infrastructure, his ideas would have just lapsed into obscurity. So we have to see there are a lot of elements in place that make this Newtonian revolution possible. One of the things missing from this Newtonian revolution is a proper epistemology. Just the way Descartes looked at the sensational new laws of motion of Galileo, and he wanted to create for Galileo a macro narrative, right? An understanding of the universe that would translate those principles of mechanical motion into far larger principles of metaphysics. Well, if that's what motion is like, what are the metaphysics of this world like? What should our understanding of knowledge be like? How do we know what we know? All these things are laid to waste, pushed off the screen when the Aristotelian universe collapses. And Descartes steps in and gives a brand new worldview. And yet that's not the worldview, as we've said, that we proceed forward with. We're going to go not with Cartesianism, but with Newtonianism. And it is actually John Locke who is going to be the epistemologist, the philosopher of knowledge, who translates Newtonian physics into a modern Newtonian scientific philosophy of knowledge. So what are his priorities? Well, we know for John Locke, who is a contemporary of Newton, born actually 10 years earlier, but he's very, very inspired by Newton and very appalled by Descartes. There's things that Descartes does that seem very presumptuous. I think, therefore I am. Descartes refers to these inner, given, clear first principles that are granted there by God, placed in our consciousness, and he offers no real evidence for that. And every single thing he then goes on to demonstrate when he's out to make his total statement describing the entire state of the physical world is leveraged by this one statement, I think, therefore I am. This, to Locke, was profoundly unsatisfying and profoundly dangerous. And then he looked at what Newton did. And he looked how Newton actually comes right out and says, I don't make hypotheses. So unlike Descartes, Newton is modest and cautious and doesn't overstate things. He doesn't overassert. He doesn't pretend to know what he doesn't know. Locke likes that. Locke is born into a world where people are far too certain about what they know. They are not only having, like Descartes, rational revelations of certainty, like I think, therefore I am, and referring just to what's going on in their minds in order to create a program for how to behave in the real world. But remember, they're also getting voices from God. They're getting impulses like, I had a message from God, and he gave me the instructions I should go level Parliament and make way for a new Jerusalem. People are getting crazy ideas, and they're getting these crazy ideas, and they're acting out on them without caution, without any kind of way of checking. Are you right? Is that what you believe? Why do you believe it? You see, I think, therefore I am doesn't really give you a very good mechanism by which to check, to test, back off, and make sure what you know is right. So there's something about Newton that is cautious, empirical, and observant that Locke really likes. And yet, Newton is able to describe the world with a profundity, even with these limitations, that Descartes could only dream of. So, like Descartes, his questions are fundamentally what we are going to believe. And unlike Descartes, he wants to create a program that is cautious, incremental, and very, very subject to proof and demonstration. How does he do this? First of all, people feel that they know way too many things. People feel that they are seized by truth with a capital T. And when you know what you know because of some innate principle, an innate idea put there by God, or because of some divine revelation, a voice in your head put there by God, when you turn only inward to hear the voices, then you find the huge true revelation that justifies revolution, justifies regicide. There's no breaks. So the first thing Locke wants to do is get rid of these innate ideas. They're dangerous. People thinking that they have a grasp of some divine revelation, whether it's going to be like Cartesian reason, where the divine revelation is mathematical reasoning, or through the ecstatic revelation of a religious enthusiast who has been touched by God. These people, in Locke's mind, are dangerous, and they have brought the world down around his knees. He has seen this world destroyed by revolution, rocked by radicalism, and then all the hopes of that Republican revolutionary age of the 1650s pushed back when they restore the monarchy, a reactionary monarchy, in 1660. So Locke sees that we are wobbling, this lack of moderation, this presumption about what is the nature of truth has created the opposite of synthesis. It has created radicalism and conservative reaction, a seesaw of tumult. What if you wipe the slate clean? What if you say we're all born with a blank slate? Guess what? We don't think, therefore we are. We only know that right now we know nothing. Neither principles nor ideas are innate. No sure thing, no direct line to God. You must be humble like Newton, not presumptuous like Descartes. He imagines in a way this blank slate is like the mind is a dark room. And we need the 5 windows of the senses to let in the light, to let in the world. If you actually want to know what's true, you can't turn inward. You must turn outward and observe. So the way his epistemology is going to work is with little baby steps. Sense impressions are very important. You're born with a blank slate. The only information that is going to be coming to you is through your senses. As a baby, these senses are very just physical, right? You might have something, oh, it's soft, something smells good, but as you age, as you go along, as you make more sense impressions, you're able to start to analyze these sense impressions and get an understanding that the world has patterns and categories. So you might see, I have a red fire truck. Mommy has a red rose in the front garden. Red rose, red fire truck. Higher principle of red. Higher principle of red. I know this concept of red exists, but look how it was reasoned from smaller observations based on lots of different red things. So when you want to ask this person, how do you know such a thing as red exists? Well, I saw a red rose. I saw a red fire hydrant. Red is something that I observed, and after careful observations, maybe over many months in my baby carriage, I observed there was this principle of red. See? He's able to reverse engineer from his larger conclusions all the baby steps that led to it. So now, when that baby, say, grows up, and all of a sudden he's seized with this notion, oh, I think I need to go to Munster and establish a kingdom, like a commune of Christians living polygamously, and we're going to destroy all the magistrates in town and then set fire to the city. When he gets that idea, he might go, wait a minute, if I were to reverse engineer that proposal, when did I really get this idea? Oh, I was hallucinating, or oh, I was drunk, or oh, I was dreaming. He's going to be able to see that this was not the reasoned conclusions. He can't show the proof. He can't give you the demonstration of how he arrived at those conclusions. Ergo, he'll know that is not sound reasoning. Maybe I better not go off and do those things. Locke is engineering cautious, disciplined, reasonable people who are going to be responsible for what they believe. So responsible, they're going to have to prove it. Prove the baby steps of their reasoning. And yet, we are not alone with this blank slate, just fabricating knowledge from random impressions. Locke is a religious person. He believes that God gave us reason. Reason isn't an idea. It is not an innate idea. Reason is a capacity of mind put there by the Creator. As a man or woman, you are endowed with the capacity of reason. Reason is a procedure. God also gave you senses you can trust. God created this world. It is harmonious and lawful. Newton demonstrated that. Newton showed that through careful observation of the world, you can come to know its deepest, deepest secrets. So trust your senses, apply reason and reflection, and through the synergy of these two things, reason that God gave you, the ability to reflect reasonably on sense data that God guarantees. So if you see a little red station wagon, chances are there really is a little red station wagon. We are not all trapped in our minds, right? We are not all solipsistic individuals who only exist because we think, therefore I am. We are actually people who can confirm and share knowledge intersubjectively. If everybody in this room agrees there is no pink elephant in here, but you are the one individual seeing a pink elephant. According to Locke's epistemology, you have to then say, maybe I have not reasoned correctly, or maybe I cannot trust my senses. This is not a recipe for radical, wild nonconformity. This is a reasonable, orderly world. Remember, reason is something God gave us. It's something we all share. You either reason well or you reason poorly. But it's a capacity we all share. But even though this is not necessarily nonconformist, it's highly individual. What can you really trust? How can you know what you know? Trust your own reason, trust your own senses, unless you have reason not to. You say you've been drunk or emotional or all those things that might impact your judgment. But nonetheless, reason is something that is universal and that we all share. But hold on. Locke is also a relativist. We're going to understand now why Locke is so key to our modern epistemology. All these words I'm throwing out, reason, self-referential sense of right and wrong, and now relativism. Well, Locke understands that reason is a procedure, right? Reason is something that God gave you, but yet not everybody reasons the same. If you have an excellent education, you might be taught to cultivate your reason over time. So some people are going to reason better than others because they've cultivated this gift. Also, everybody has different data. So if you're building your truth with a little t from the ground up, from little baby steps, from little observations you made as a child, to the much vaster principles that you might come to conclude in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, you're going to be much more reasonable, much more sound in your judgment as an older person than a younger person who hasn't had a chance to reflect on a lot of data. So people might have various opinions. Truth will be relative. What is true for the young man might be less true for the old man. But truth is also relative in the sense that if you grew up in India versus growing up in England, the experiences you had might lead you to reasonably conclude different things, right? So you're not going to have the same experience, therefore you're not going to draw the same conclusions. Both reasonable, but the conclusions aren't true. They are relative to the point of view of the person who's doing the reasoning. So Locke's program is profoundly sophisticated in its relativism, in its granting of human cognitive authority to the individual, and in its appreciation for the importance of being able to prove what you say and being responsible for what you believe. Now, how does that work out politically? How does this help us formulate a Newtonian politics? Well, Descartes, we've said, is very inspired by Newton and very profoundly inspired by the natural order, the lawful, harmonious universe that Newton revealed. And this is important because Locke understands that you can look to nature to find this order. And when Locke looks to nature, he says, you know, if I take a walk in the woods, nowhere do I see a divinely born king. I don't know what a divine right looks like. Can you prove it? Since we have this new philosophical program that requires proof and demonstration, you've got to be able to show me what a divine right is. You've got to be able to prove to me how you concluded that. And looking at nature, I see no such thing. And so Locke gives us a politics of nature that is very, very liberal. He's going to show us that men in nature are born free. And here's the important part. You are born free. There's no evidence in nature that people are born under the subjugation of another person. However, this he will concede, that a state of nature is a grueling one. You will often find yourself at risk from, the competition that is rife in nature. And so you may voluntarily surrender your right to govern yourself and enter into a social contract and agree to be governed by the laws of society. Wow. Being governed is something you have to consent to. Because he noticed that your natural rights in a state of nature, you are born with freedom. It's inalienable. Only you can sign that away and consent to be governed. Divine kings don't ask your consent to govern you. So this, in a way, is very, very radical. And yet, Hobbes, too, had a theory of nature. Okay, come over here. Okay, we'll just finish up. Hobbes, too, had a theory of nature, remember? Hobbes said, oh, yeah, let me tell you about your nature. You are a deterministic machine. You are running a program that says you're going to seek the most pleasure and you're going to avoid the most pain. And in order to keep you from making sociopathic decisions like stealing things, because it's really fun to go out stealing other people's things and burning their cars and ransacking their homes, in order to keep you from doing all that stuff, we're going to need an authoritarian state. Notice how Locke thinks, no, you are born in a state of freedom and you also have this you're not deterministically programmed, right? You're not just a utility maximizing machine that wants to create pleasure and avoid pain. What's your essential characteristic? You are reasonable. You are reflective. And notice how, in this program, this citizen that Locke is talking about, he is going to be governed not by oppression, not by state authority, but the principle of order for Locke, and for us, by the way, is reason. The reason why we don't go off breaking laws randomly is not because there are policemen on the street, right? Most of us don't need to have a policeman present in order not to break the law. So Locke's theory is, in a way, the one that we carried forward with here. It's instantiated in our own cultural values. We are orderly because we reason that it is in our best interest. I entered into this social contract. Government is in my best interest. And therefore, I am going to obey the law freely, not coercively. And this kind of a person, where the very state of order, right? This citizen, in order to secure his orderly cooperation with the social contract, with the social program, again, it's not going to be police, it's going to be education, it's going to be cultivating reason. This is progressive, this is liberal, this is enlightened, this is Newtonian, this is the beginning of modernity. It is our own political philosophy and epistemology of truth. We have truth with a little t, just as Locke. We know truth is something that you're going to be working on for your whole life. Part of it is going to be going to school, studying a discipline. Part of it is going to be reflection. Part of it is going to be life experience, travel. But you know that coming to any certain conclusion about the meaning of life is a long, cautious, careful, procedural thing where you must ultimately rely on yourself, but hopefully be guided by faculties of reason that are socially cultivated in things like universities and civic values. Okay, so the important part of that, what do we get? That was the abstract philosophical reasoning. What is the concrete instance of this Lockean philosophy? Well, Locke was also the political philosopher for the Glorious Revolution. And in 1688, you have the Glorious Revolution, which is a moderate, modest, reasonable, middle-class affair. Not the crazy affair where you had the Puritans and the Roundheads and the Levelers all going at each other in 1649 and resulting in the murder of the king. This was a very cordial affair where James II, who was Catholic, and who had recently begotten a Catholic son in his second marriage, so this was a bit of a surprise, and parliamentary figures with the support of both the liberal aristocracy, the Anglicans, this burgeoning middle class, they all knew that we don't want a Catholic king. We don't want this dangerous, reactive philosophy. We want these new, progressive, liberal values. So they decide to depose the king. He understands that there's really little he can do, so he flees to France, seeks protection of Louis XIV, and the reformers, we call them the glorious revolutionaries, place on the throne James II's daughter, who is a Protestant, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. So that's Mary and William and Mary. And the important thing to know about them is they had to sign a certain document before they were allowed to be king. So did they become rulers of England by divine right? No. They became rulers by parliamentary decree. They became rulers in a way, rulers who were constitutionally circumscribed by the law. Locke looked to nature and saw everywhere matter is subject to gravity, everywhere laws prevail. I can find no instance of anything in the state of nature being above the law. Why should kings be? So now this king and this queen are subject to parliamentary laws, and you have a very moderate revolution. So these Newtonian politics then are middle of the road. Did they get rid of the monarchy? No. They're going to keep the monarch, but they're going to make this monarch constitutional. Is this a radical revolution where all of a sudden you have peasants running the show? No, this is a bourgeois, middle-class revolution led by intellectuals. It also has the support of Anglican aristocrats and elites. So it is very much of a coalition. And the understanding, the Newtonian understanding, is that God has a hand in creating a world that is lawful. There are laws. There is cosmic order. There are hierarchies. There is harmony. So God wouldn't want this sort of chaos, this war of all against all, everybody behaving according to their own desire in an egalitarian way. No, God would want lawful, conservative, harmonious social structures, and so look to preserve the laws that God has given us and the harmony God has given us. And yet, this is a new kind of politics, as we said before, so I don't want to overly repeat myself, but notice it is liberal. It includes people from the middle class. It includes new ideas. It includes intellectuals. It values new forms of achievement, new forms of social status. It is individualistic. Reason is a highly individualistic exercise. Reason is not blind obedience. Reason is, by its very nature, something that is subjective and self-referential. Also, when you reason, it implies you have not yet come to a conclusion. You don't yet know the truth with a capital T. That is the nature of progress. Refining, reasoning, discovering a more refined, a better society, a more progressive form of truth. And yet, it is hierarchical. Some people are just more reasonable than others, right? So we're going to still have those old elites, the intellectuals, the university-educated people, the people at the Royal Society, people who have access to becoming more reasonable are still going to run the show. So it's still hierarchical, but it's starting to value new kinds of qualities and make room for a new, more modern types of contributions. Now, we talk about Newtonian religion. So if we look at this larger synthesis, what we're really driving at, and I know you guys have an essay on this, is how we're overcoming things that are potentially hugely oppositional. And we're not going to really understand that until we see what happened in France, where they don't get a Newtonian version of theology that the church can be happy with, right? Where they don't get a sort of centrist, moderate Newtonian politics that accommodates the new economic and social classes. They fail to create these reconciliations, and instead their society is torn into small pieces. What makes this tick? What makes this work? What gives us a British Enlightenment that is very different from the violence of the French experience, is the Anglican clergy's decision to sponsor this Newtonian idea. And if you think about it, Newton's got a lot going for him. If you're an Anglican clergyman, just remember that's Church of England. That's the one that Henry VIII, when he wanted to get rid of the Pope and establish himself as the head of the Church of England, he established the Anglican Church. However, that's it. He just wanted to get rid of the Pope and put himself in charge. He didn't want to go crazy making too many modifications. He certainly didn't want to end up, right, like Charles I having his head cut off. So he was very resistant to these more radical Protestant things. So the Anglican Church is pretty conservative. They keep two of the main, the two big sacraments, and then they actually preserve 5 of the other Catholic sacraments as moderate sacraments. So it's very, very middle of the road. You have baptism and the Eucharist as the main sacraments, and then keeps the other ones, just modifies them, keeps a priesthood, keeps a hierarchy of bishops. Almost everything's the same. It still has a lot of the same grandiosity of Catholicism. So this is a religion that is by its nature conservative and elitist, and it supports Newton for several reasons. Theism. Newton sees the universe in relation to a present, caring, loving, personal God. God is not just some architect that winds it up and leaves. God is not some impersonal mathematical architect of Descartes, some reason, some rationalizing machine. No, this is a personal, loving God. There's also Newtonianism leaves room for debate, dispute. It has, the Anglican Church doesn't want to be too repressive. That is doing nothing for the Catholic Church. So even though the Anglican Church is more traditional, it has plenty of room, and there's more and more parliamentary representation for those more radical forms of Protestantism. So what the Anglican community wants to do is create something that is synthetic, that promotes peace. The word here that I've used is irenical, and it seeks unity and peace among various Christian sects. The big thing is we're all English. We should not fight over matters of religion. We should submerge, since none of us can be really, really sure, right? With this Lockean and Newtonian epistemology. Newton says no fingo hypotheses. Locke is never going for the truth with a big T. None of us can really be sure. So let's respect everybody's right to find salvation on their own, right? So that's very, very Protestant. But at the same time, let's all secretly acknowledge amongst ourselves that reason and more reasonable people probably are going to understand the truth a little bit better, and we Anglicans are much more reasonable than those more enthusiastic people that are a little too emotional. So they make room for unity, but they still maintain this elite privilege of rationality and reason. So the important thing is Newtonian physics can be adapted to a program because of Lockean epistemology, because Locke promotes this view of reason that makes religion safe from the destructive impulses of enthusiasts. And there's another important element to this. Tabula rasa, blank slate. You don't want God giving you any strange ideas. God is not going to act through you anymore. And God is not looking to you to deliver some kind of political mission here on earth, the way he did with the Jews in the Old Testament. That's over. So if you think you're on a mission from God, chances are you're not. So anybody who's having that kind of relationship with God would be considered to be unreasonable. God has a moral relationship to you. He's not going to muck about in daily affairs and politics. Just leave that to the Anglican bishops, the king, and the parliament. All you have to understand is that you're in moral relationship to God. That means take care of your sins. God cares that you're a good person. And God is very involved in your salvation and wants you to go to heaven. But God is not, I repeat, not giving you messages about overthrowing the government. So see how this all works for a conservative theology. And remember in the 1600s and the 1500s when you kind of blew the cork off religion. where you had all of these people rushing to get their copies of the Old Testament and the New Testament and stop having the church interpret it for them and get their own message. Well, there's some really strange and radical ideas in the Bible. So if you pay too much attention to Scripture, you might start to become a person that is very much obsessed with predicting the end of the world. You know that in Christianity, every century there's some kind of millenarian movement, some kind of idea that the reign of Christ has come. There'll be the 1,000-day rule of Christ, at the end of which will be the rapture in which he brings the saved up to heaven. All of these ideas are somewhere kicking around there in the Bible, in the book of Revelations, not filtered out by a controlling Catholic priesthood. So all of this Protestant emphasis on reading the Bible was starting to create a very radical Christianity, way more radical than the Anglican Church wanted. People that think that the end of the world is nigh don't behave in a very conservative way. They don't pay their taxes. They don't obey the king. They have much more pressing issues. So there's something about Newtonian theology that says Scripture is very important, but God also wrote the book of nature. And the book of nature is not telling you that, that the world is coming to an end. The book of nature should show you that this is a harmonious existence, that it is peaceful and orderly and lawful. So nature itself models reason in a way that Scripture doesn't. So by balancing Scripture with reason, Newtonian theology creates a much more middle-of-the-road, moderate, and reasonable program of how you're going to relate to God that is going to overcome some of these. We can't even emphasize enough how violent and chaotic the 1500s and the 1600s are. And if the church moves forward with those ideas, civilization is just going to drive itself off a cliff. This was the decision to be more reasonable, more cautious, more relativistic about the nature of truth. And then I have one last thing there, if you want. I mean, your essay can't be a million lines long, but the relationship that Newton has, or at least the Newtonianism. Notice how when you first learned about Newton in high school, you didn't learn about the occult stuff, the astrology, the biblical prophecy, the hermetic magic, the emerald tablet. You didn't learn about any of that stuff. That is the secret occult Newton. And that guy already, because he's publishing the Principia in 1687, after you've had several decades of the rise of mechanism, he's already pretty secretive about this tendency. So even though Newton is able to conceive his program in this intellectual laboratory that's very hermetic and occult, the actual product, as interpreted by other people, is going to be more like what we've been talking about: reasonable, orderly, lawful. Nature is inert. Remember, God created matter, and he did not create a hidden symbolic order. A rose is just a rose, right? Copper is not having some secret rapport with Venus, all right? Nature is simple, it is material, it is reductive. This is still mechanical philosophy. It's still based on atoms in motion. And when we get to the final installation of this Newtonian transformation, which begins as a scientific revolution, becomes a revolution in epistemology, a new program for truth-seeking, not just in science, but in moral and political philosophy. It is also going to become a program that transforms economics, that engages people of all walks of life. This is a true revolution. Like I said, you can write all that you need to know about Newton on a cocktail napkin. You have this new lay public, right? They're already reading, these Protestants are already part of a culture of literacy because they had to read the Bible. Since they couldn't trust the church, they had to read the Bible in order to be saved. So into this culture of literacy, you have these people who are now hungry for a new kind of information. Newton's laws. They have a sense that to become more reasonable, they need more information. Information is good. And they become very interested not just in technical education, so you start to have these itinerant scientists who are going around, and for a couple of bob, they're giving a lecture here and there, so people, local people, can afford to get themselves educated. They don't need to go off to a fancy school. And these people have different values. If you're someone who's in manufacturing, if you're a farmer or an inventor, you're not like Descartes wanting to create some grand schema for the meaning of life. How do I spin this cotton faster? How can I make this soil more productive? Very, very practical things, practical ingenuity. If God is ingenious, then human ingenuity is a good thing. Remember, we've had a middle-class revolution, that the people in Parliament now who have subject the king to their constitutional reforms are largely drawn right from this new class, this expanded House of Commons. They're farmers, they're manufacturers, there's in some cases burgeoning capitalists, bankers, shipping merchants. They're people who like discovery, who tend to be a little more radical than just your elite form of Anglicanism, who think human beings are here to wonder at God's world, but also to make a contribution, also here to make things better. This is a progressive idea. How do I improve manufacturing is some ways a corollary to how do I improve myself ethically. These things aren't seen as in conflict, that it is good to discover, to explore, to improve. It is good to make a social contribution. It's not good just to be obedient. Now we value other types of things. So if you make a great discovery, this society welcomes you. You don't just, in order to get the praise of this world now, elites still have a tremendous amount of mystique and power. So we're not going to say we've gotten rid of the aristocrats, but we've made room at the table for a burgeoning new class who are not only allowed to contribute, but they're allowed to reap rewards, because these people are going to get rich. So this is a culture of ingenuity and entrepreneurship, and it is also a culture that, like Newton, promotes as a study of the physical world. So you get all of these naturalistic societies. So it's not just for intellectuals anymore. There'll be the butterfly club in East Sussex, counting how many 57 types of butterflies there are. There'll be people that are very interested in reading the latest literature on the star-bellied sneetch, if they're into Dr. Seuss. But you see that there's people now that are just lay, average people who are now understanding that learning about nature, and what do you think the British, still to this day, they're obsessed with bird watching. The British were also the ones that came up with much of animal husbandry, right? This sort of active idea of improving and observing the world. So they are, have devised most of the canine breeds. So it's a brand new world. And you have, out of all this new kind of specialized knowledge that is being pursued by lay people, not just by professional people or clerical people, you get the beginning of an explosion of knowledge. Because now everybody's writing each other. There's starting to be hundreds of these local little journals, and we get the beginnings of not just science with a big S, or science as this grand philosophical enterprise, disciplinary science, the science we have today, where you have a specialty, almost an obsession. So that is the moderate context of the British Enlightenment. And I've said most of this, so the next generation, we talked about the Great Revolution and this Newtonian synthesis, which is scientific, intellectual, political, cultural. What does this look like at the beginning of the 18th century? Well, we don't know how it's going to turn out. This was a big gamble, a big risk, putting William and Mary on the throne. And then it turns out William and Mary die without any offspring. Then Anne, Mary's sister, dies without any offspring. This is a moment where this whole thing could have come apart. But the Parliament is so strong, and this moderate revolution is so in place that they are now able to go back to the Hanoverian electorate, the elector of Hanover, and say, you are going to be our king. That's when we get the three Georges. but sign this first, and it's a done deal. From now on, Britain in the 18th century is going to look very moderate. There's not going to be a revolution. They have these kings who, although they are powerful, are losing more and more of their actual control of the government machinery. By the time we get to the 1720s, we have a prime minister. The king used to be the prime minister, pulling all the gears of the machinery. But now we have somebody else who's actually going to start taking over control of the government, like Tony Blair, right, and Gordon Brown. They're actually doing most of the work now, and the Queen is much more of a figurehead. We start to get that, so we get a de facto constitutional monarchy more and more, and not just one in name only. And to understand the most profound revolution that is going to happen in the 18th century in England, when we talk about France, we are going to be dealing with a rich, rich, spectacular terrain of, seething with intellectual revolutionary concepts. That's not really what's happening in England. The really interesting stuff in intellectual history is happening in France. But England is actually having a much more profound revolution on many levels, because it's economic, it's industrial. They're going to start to grind the wheel, turn the wheel that is going to change the way people live in the world. They are going to, by the end of the century, put in place a kind of factory discipline, new capitalist forms of financing, grand economic schemes that are going to be the harbingers of our modern world. And they're going to do it, like I said, through largely economic means, through the market economy. I don't have time to go into that, but I think you've all probably taken a class where you've heard of Adam Smith. Competition, innovation, ingenuity, progress, change, harmony, order, not chaos, not violence, not conflict. And one last statement so that you can see how this diffuses potential revolution through synthesis. I've talked about a new manufacturing class, a new trading class, but what happens to those aristocrats? The most powerful people in the scheme are going to be the capitalists. Well, the aristocrats who are smart know that, you know what? You're not rich anymore if you've just got, your hundreds of thousands of acres. It helps, but you're not. The real money is now made in money. It's made in trade and manufacturing. So the aristocrats become the partners of these bankers and these merchants. They become the partners, the investing class, and then the lower classes, of course, are demoted to the industrial laboring class, so they're rather left out. But there's still room in the middle. The middle class now is expanding to include artisans and innovators. Like Eli Whitney was nobody terribly elite. I think he was himself just a manufacturer, and he made this innovation of the spinning jenny, and then he becomes hugely, hugely wealthy and successful. But he's from this artisanal class and sort of generates this wealth and success. So there's more social mobility and yet a role so that the elites are not threatened by all this social mobility. Because if you invest in Eli Whitney's factory, you're going to be rich. And whatever radical thinking there is, the deistic, the pantheistic, the sort of hermetic, occult, this is not about oppression, because oppression breeds conflict. Remember, the Catholic Church used to take an approach that was about assimilation, moderation, the middle of the road. That is the attitude in England. It is not very oppressive, but they do drive these other ideas that are more controversial, sort of driven underground into this secret society. The Freemasons are a good example. You get the establishment of the first London Lodge in 1717. Today we associate this with all sorts of occult magic. But in a way, this was established as a free thinking place, a place where you could bring all your crazy ideas that people just wanted to engage in an enlarged discourse about the nature of reality, the nature of God. In their constitution, when they do refer to God, they refer to him as the great architect. So a lot of this is driven by a lot of rationalistic thinking. But the genius of this program is that a lot of these people that are actually members, secret members of the Masonic Society, by day might be Anglican clergy, or they're probably sitting in Parliament or attending the Royal Society. So this is hardly a dissident space. It is more of a way to contain free thought, give it an outlet, even have mainstream people participate it, but understand that it is potentially dangerous, so you give it its own separate sphere, right, in which to exercise it. It's free, it's not oppressed, but it is just the way we have magic moved off to a separate sphere, and nobody's going to come and bust you for that if you choose to, practice magic in your basement. You start to get a sense that this is going to have to be pushed into a separate sphere. However, this radical thought, because England is having an enlightenment that is so moderate and so balanced, doesn't really pose a threat to England. But these ideas, when they cross the channel, are going to very much contribute to juicing the French Revolution. Because English ideas, which in England are moderate and really a sort of middle class, middle of the road, monarchical, aristocratic, and middle class, all melded into one. These ideas are unbelievably radical in the French setting. So what do we have in the French setting? It's not just Catholic. Louis XIV in his later days becomes sort of ultra-Catholic. Louis XIV, is he a constitutional monarch? No, he says things like, l'état c'est moi. I am the state. What do you mean, constitution? So he is above the parliament. All the laws of France literally flow from his decrees. It is feudal. They've got a feudal class that is hanging on to all their privileges. They're mucking up the works for this new entrepreneurial class, cannot make any headway. They're not building clothing factories in France. This is actively being suppressed. These elites are incredibly intimidated. They see their share of the pie as being threatened, so they actively are in conflict and have a lot of contempt. The French aristocratic attitude towards the bourgeoisie is profoundly contemptuous, whereas there's much more of a rapport or mutual respect, still very hierarchical, but not the sort of contempt the aristocrats had, and there's no potential partnership because both of these sort of economic systems have not been synthesized harmoniously. They're in conflict. One is feudal, agrarian, based on collecting privileges and fees, and the other one wants to break open into a free market system that is about competition and free trade and maybe letting a different class take some of the power. So you don't get any cooperation amongst these various people. You have conflict. And so far, because you have such a strong monarch, the modernizing impulses are absolutely under the thumb of this very strong monarch who supports a very Catholic church because it's in his interest to do so. And the aristocracy, which is growing very, very weak, actually has to cling to these old ways, old world views, because that was the original source of their authentic power. So they're not going to have any room for this. Adding fuel to the fire that's ready to break out. In 1705, Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes was passed in 1685. It said a very simple, very progressive, very modern thing. Huguenots and Catholics, please stop killing each other. Let's let everybody believe what they need in their hearts to believe. Modern idea. That's what the British did. And yet, in 1705, Louis XIV decides to revoke the Edict of Nantes. What does that tell us about what the 18th century is going to look like? The 18th century in France is going to be reactionary, oppressive, and in order to hold on to these dying feudal privileges, rather than making an accommodation with modernity, they're going to make a last stand against it. In terms of transforming the day-to-day life, the way we talked about how just the British laity, the farmers, the manufacturers were learning everything they could about Newtonianism and applying it in their daily lives, where are these French people going to learn it? the church isn't going to teach Newtonianism. Remember, and I don't think I stressed this point enough, Descartes was a bit of a big chicken. And when he published Le Monde, he was very cagey about leaving Copernicanism out of it. So even though Copernicanism is totally implied by the mathematics, he never says he's a Copernican. So now you get the church looking for a new kind of naturalistic philosophy. Newton is going to be way more dangerous, ironically, than Descartes. Why? Well, because the church has really hung itself in terms of Copernican theory. They placed that book on the papal index, right, of banned books. They put Galileo under house arrest. What are they going to say now? Just kidding? So the fact that Newton was in an Anglican context, the Anglican Church never made that big a deal about Copernicanism, so Newton's Copernicanism wasn't seen as that radical, and his theism was seen as wonderful. The Catholic Church doesn't have that option in France, so what was a moderate theological policy in England becomes something very, very controversial for the Catholics in France. So they're not going to teach Newtonianism. Like I said, the aristocrats aren't going to teach it or be interested in it. Why are they going to empower this new class of learning? They're going to stick with the Catholic philosophy that always gave them their power in the first place. So you don't get this great synthesis that we saw in the British context, where people from all walks of life, from every category, are affected by this and drawn into a new paradigm. So we know that our English natural philosophers, for the most part, are pretty moderate. They're those Royal Society guys. They're mechanists, but they're Newtonian mechanists. They have a warm relationship with a theistic God. They like their mathematical calculation, and they are much more empirical and investigative. And there's a place for mystery in their world. But think about if you're a philosopher. Think about if you're one of these French natural philosophers, and you have the most oppressive monarchy ever to bestride the earth, Louis XIV, this horrible parasitic aristocracy, this reactionary Catholic Church. Every time you turn around, you're being oppressed, fined, deported. Do you really want there to be this mysterious principle of gravity with the hand of God of correcting the orbits of the universe? No, because if you let God back into this universe, the one where they pushed through Descartes, they used Cartesianism to push God out. If you let God back in, who is God traditionally the ally of? God is the ally of the church. God is the ally of the aristocrats. God is the ally of the king. We don't want your Newtonianism because the mystery at the heart of your scientific theory is dangerously superstitious, and we're afraid it's just going to empower the reactionaries. So that's part of the reason why the mechanism in France, rather than finding some accommodation, some middle road, is militant. So these people in France have a much more militant, mechanical understanding of the world because they can't afford to let God in, because God is seen as a sort of jackbooted bully who is the ally of their oppressors. They also think the idea of Newtonian, one more minute, I'm down with that. They also think the idea of Newtonian gravity is quite frankly weak. Remember, they're really, really big on mathematical demonstration. And they think it's just sorry that Newton can't even prove the stability of his own orbits mathematically, that his math isn't sufficient to explain his own theory. If your math can't explain your theory, you've got a crummy theory. And third thing, Newton is English. So by that reason alone, they could never become Newtonians. So we have a lot of radicalism brewing on the continent, a lot of resistance to Newton. And we're going to see how this is going to rip the world up after our exciting midterm. There'll be more excitement with the French Revolution.